Welcome to Cash Plays. And now your host, Bart Hanson.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Cash Plays Samoleus 2, Part 2. Of course, we did Part 1 last week. I am once again joined by Neiman Ken Cray. You can email the show at cashplays@pokerroad.com, Skype me over at bart.hanson, and check out the Poker Road forums, which I used a bunch of questions for this interview last week, and I will be following up this week with some more questions. Samoleus, Neiman, Punkity, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Glad. Thanks, Bart. Glad to be here.
Cool. We kind of bounced around last week with some strategy questions, and then some, we went over a good portion of kind of what you talked about, psychological wellness, which I think was very, very interesting. We're going to take the same direction this week with some strategy questions and some, other questions that aren't related to strategy. The first thing I want to lead off with here, Neiman, is actually a question that I came up with, and I don't know if I've ever seen it expressed in words before on a training site or anywhere else on a forum. And it's something that happened to me last week, and I've touched on it a little bit in previous episodes, but not to the extent that I want to get into it with you now. And that's the concept of checking when out of position to a habitual river thin value better. Okay, so you're out of position, you check to a river thin value better, and you check call for value, because if you were to bet, he would fold his hand. But when you check to him, he bets for value, and you actually make more value out of your hand. And I just want to give you a quick example. I played a hand in 10-20 last week, and I don't think the guy was sophisticated enough to do this, but it just kind of got me thinking, where basically I raised with ace-king under the gun and got a couple of callers, and the board came out ace-king-8 with two spades, and I bet everybody folded and went back to the blind, and this guy called. The turn was an offsuit jack. He checked, I bet again, he called. The river completed the flush, did not pair the board. He checked again. I thought that he had a hand like ace-jack or an ace-queen, and I thought he would call me, so I made not even that thin of a value bet, but I made a value bet with top two, and he check called with a flush. And I turned that hand around because if he were to bet the river, and he's a pretty straightforward player, I probably would have folded. What's your take on that whole situation?
That's not really that uncommon, Bart. It's where you have a hand that is absolutely strong enough to call against your opponent's range of hands that he'll bet, but not strong enough to bet against the range of hands that he'll call with.
Okay.
It's and basically that's what it comes down to, is evaluating ranges of hands. So in this particular generalized scenario, you'd want to ask yourself, what is your opponent going to bet for value thinner, or will he call against your bet thinner? So it does definitely go hand in hand with turning your hand into like a bluff catcher type hand as well. Clearly this is similar to trying to induce a bluff from your opponent. Basically what it comes down to is your hand. Here's a good way to explain it. You have a hand after some betting and after some action and the last river card's completed, and you have a hand that is going to be both better than your opponent's bluffing range, obviously. It beats a bluff, but it also beats a thin value, right?
Right.
So now you check it to him in both cases, because if he's on a bluff, say for instance, let's say you have a made hand on a drawy board, and the draw, let's say there was a straight draw and a flush draw, and the straight draw hit, but the flush draw missed, and you have a set or something. Something like that where you can't beat the straight or anything. Now, it doesn't make a lot of sense to call here, maybe because he would fold most of his range. But let's say this guy would bet his missed flush draws, then you definitely want to check to pick up the bet there. But it's also if you show weakness with the check on the river, and you have a player who's going to try, because actually it's the better players, in fact, that will try to squeeze out the extra value when they think their hand is good. Against those, it's a good counterbalancing measure to check and call. Again, an example. I guess there's no need to give an example because your example is actually a very good one. In the example that you gave, you had the ace king in the top two, and it was hard to believe under the way the hand played out that your ace king was not good because your opponent took the step of checking. Now at the same time, it would be very hard for him to get paid off if he had check called you twice, then the flush hits and he leads into you. You know what I mean? So you would have probably gotten away from your ace king. But at the same time, if he now checks it on the river, there's a plethora of hands that he could have that are not as good as ace king that he could call a bet with, starting with ace jack and moving on down. And so he played that hand very well by checking to you, and you certainly did not make a mistake because presumably he has a large range of hands with which he could have called you river bet as well.
Now let's take this question to, let's say to the next step. Now obviously this hand would apply, let's say that if he made the nut flush on the river and he absolutely had the nut flush, and let's say he played it the same way. Now obviously he's not going to check call, he's going to check raise because he has the nut flush. But, and this is probably player dependent, but I want to get some of the listeners thinking about it. At what point can you make a check raise in that spot with the non-nut hand? And what I mean by that is if he check raises with, say, should he check raise with the third nut flush there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it comes up often in advanced games. And basically, it comes down to one question that you have to answer for yourself. And the question is this. How often your hand could, for instance, your hand could absolutely almost 100% for sure be the best hand, but yet there's no value in a check raise because you're only going to get called or raised by a better hand.
Right, I'm never calling his check raise.
Like let me give you a really good example,
sure.
Right? Let's say that the final board is 7-6-5 and then the 2 all of spades and then some brick. Okay? Let's say there's ace of diamonds, 7-6-5 of spades, and the 2 of spades.
Okay. Or some brick, you mean like not a fourth spade, but an offsuit.
No, I am saying.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So the final board after the action in the hand is ace of diamonds, 7 of spades, 6 of spades, 5 of spades, 2 of spades.
Right.
Okay? And let's say you have the ace of spades in your hand. Ace of spades and king of hearts or whatever, okay?
Right.
Now, in most cases, this is not a good spot to check raise. It just doesn't make a lot of sense, and I'll tell you why. If you check and your opponent bets, now I'm not saying that you should necessarily check call or lead, depending on your opponent, depending on the way the hand played out. Either one of those could be better. Let's say you're out of position. But if you decide to go for the checking option and try to induce a bet from him and he bets, you absolutely should just call unless you're playing against a very poor player. Or, we're into very deep levels of thinking where he expects you to run a sophisticated check raise river bluff. And the reason is this. When there's 4 spades on the board and you check raise and obviously he doesn't have the ace of spades, it's hard to believe that he would bet for value with the king of spades or less and then call the check raise, right? On the other hand, in that rare, almost, very, very rare scenario in which he's got the 2 card straight flush, you've set yourself up to get blasted. You know what I mean?
Right.
Now, so that the reason I bring this example up is to getting back to this question that you have to ask yourself. The question is this: is your opponent more likely to call your check raise with a worse hand, or is he more likely to re-raise it with a better? I'm sorry. Let me rephrase. Is he more likely to have a worse hand and call the check raise, or is he more likely to have a better hand and re-raise you?
Right.
So notice that all of the hands in which he has a worse hand but folds to your check raise are more or less irrelevant to your decision.
Right, because you get no more value because he's not calling, right?
So by check raising or check calling, you get no more value out of hands that he'll fold. So basically, you have to ask yourself, if I check raise here, how likely is it that he's going to call me with worse? And now weigh that against how likely it is that he's going to re-raise you, or call if you're re-raise, a push or whatever, with a better hand. And if in fact the answer is the latter, then you have to just check call. You have to only call, even if your hand is really good and almost definitely rating to be the best hand. For example, this hand with the ace of spades, like I told you. I mean, I'm just going to make up a sequence in which the hand may have played out, right? Let's say that you've got the ace of spades and queen of hearts in the blind, and somebody raises pre-flop and you call, and the flop comes down with an ace and the 7-6 of spades, and you check, he bets, you call, and the turn is the 5 of spades, and you check and he bets and you call, and the river's a 2 of spades. Now maybe you should just lead here and try to make it look like you're bluffing and get him to make a light call on you. But supposing you decide to check, expecting him to bet, either. Now notice that the check here, Bart, when you're on the river on this hand, it's very, you're not sure whether you're really checking to induce a bluff or checking to induce a thin value bet, like in the hand that you started this conversation with. But in either case, let's say you decide to check and now he bets. It's not a good idea to check raise there, because the way this hand is played out, he's almost never, unless he's either out of his mind or really there's a lot of leveling going between you two. He's almost never going to call a check raise with worse than, with the king of spades or worse there. However, you do leave yourself the remote possibility if he has a straight flush. Now you're going to, get re-raised or something. You know what I mean? Right,
of course. And actually, and another example pops into my head too, against, fairly sophisticated thin value bettors. We can give another example too where, say you flop a set and you bet into a pre-flop raiser and he calls and the flush card comes on the turn, and now you check, he bets, and you call, and you're fairly certain he's got a flush and he could have the nut flush. Now the river pairs the board. Again, player dependent, but a good player could, lay a hand down like that if you come out and bet your full house at the end, or if you make quads at the end or something like that. But if you check to him, he's going to have more of a range to better value, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a very good example. Again, that one's pretty player dependent and stuff, and it depends on how aggressive the game is playing. Like some of these online games, if somebody's got the nut flush, they'll often call if you check raise there anyway, but maybe not. It depends on in principle, it's a very good example. This actually, Bart, I'm glad we're talking this strategy too, because this actually leads me to something else I want to mention, and this goes hand in hand with all of the play of No Limit Hold'em. And this is, most rules of poker are flexible, they're malleable, they can be changed, you should never do this in this situation, but then there's exceptions. I can give you a rule. When I have my students and stuff, I always introduce this, and this is, in my opinion, one rule of poker that actually does not have any exceptions. This is an absolute hard set rule that everyone should follow 100% of the time. And now that I've got you all with bated breath, I'll say what it is. You should never make a raise or a bet in No Limit Hold'em if you don't know how you're going to handle being re-raised. Now notice that I'm not saying you shouldn't bet for value if you have to fold to a re-raise. No, that's not true. There's plenty of times where you can bet for value, but yet if your opponent raises you, now you have to fold you fold your hand. But you should never put yourself in a situation where you bet or raise an opponent and now don't know how to handle a re-raise from him, where you put yourself in a position to make a mistake.
Right. And I can definitely see that. It's funny. That brings me up to on an interesting hand that I discussed on the show a little bit 2 weeks ago. Again, over in the Red forums, the pro forums by I think this was posted by Brian Devonshire, where he was playing in a 3-handed pot in 10-20, where he had raised it up to 80 pre-flop with pocket sevens, and the board came out Queen 10-10. And there were 2 people in the hand. He got checked him. He bet in position, and one guy called him. The turn was a 9, completing King Jack. The guy checked. He checked behind. The river was a 7, giving him an under full. Okay?
Yep.
And the guy bet. And the stack sizes were such, Neiman, that if he had made a standard value raise on the river, if he got reshoved, he would have been getting about 2.75 to 3 to 1. And my contention was that he loses value by not raising the river there because he beats, obviously, any random 10, a king jack. But if he can't fold to a reship there, then he probably shouldn't raise on the river. What do you think about that whole discourse?
Oh, man, Bart. You just took the generalized concept that I just put out there and encapsulated it in the perfect hand. I mean, that is perfect exemplification of what I was talking about. If you have sevens full there, you are losing out on value if you just call, because there are a 10, king jack, maybe even like a hand like ace queen or something is going to make a bet there, right? You're absolutely losing value by not raising, because a lot of those hands might just call a raise as well, right? But if you get re-raised there, you are almost never if you raise on that board and get re-raised, you're going to be against a higher full house enough of the time that you should comfortably be able to fold.
Right, you're not going to be good 1 in 4 times, right? Which is basically what the pot's laying.
Right. Now again, we're assuming reasonable opponents, of course.
Right.
But so in this case, it's without question, the best play, I think, and again, assuming reasonable opponents, is to raise your opponent's bet there on the river. This is assuming, by the way, that he will make that call with king jack or a 10, which there really would be no reason for him not to, because you haven't really played your hand exuding tremendous strength, and we know the reason for that. I mean, you didn't really hit much of anything till the river, but
right.
This is absolutely a raising spot. But even as you make that raise, you need to ask yourself, what am I going to do if I'm re-raised? And the answer is that you're going to fold, and you can say that unequivocally, right? You know that you should be folding, and so you can make that raise. And so that is a hand where raising with the intent, raising for value, but being willing to fold to the re-raise is the correct play. Now let me give you another example of a situation in which a friend of mine had made put himself in a really bad spot, and it's actually a hand that I use as a template for some of my lessons. My friend was in the blind and called a raise from the cutoff with 9-8 of clubs, and you don't mind if I skip ahead to another hand, right?
Sure, no, go ahead.
And the flop came down king 9-8 with a flush draw, and they were very deep. Now, this is a situation, I think, in a previous interview that we had done, maybe it was in the spring, we had talked about hands in which, when I talked to you back in April on my first interview on the show, we had talked about hands in which it's a good idea to lead into a raiser and be willing to call when raised. This would have been a good example of that, because your hand is good enough to play for 2 bets, but it's not really good enough to check raise. The reason is, with the hand that you have, the way my friend played the hand, he checked, my opponent bet, he raised, and the opponent re-raised. And really, in that spot, you're in a really, really awkward situation. You know what I mean? And he'd never really considered the possibility of facing the re-raise. He eventually went broke for a lot on that hand, but even without being results-oriented, when you're in that situation, if you've got the 9-8 of clubs, if you decide that you're gonna, and the stacks are deep, you check and your opponent bets there, the first instinct of some players might be, well, I got 2 pair, I should definitely check raise here, I got a big hand. But with a lot of more play left in the hand, a lot of stacks behind, the board being draw heavy, and of course the possibility of being against King 9 or pocket kings or something like that, as well as all the draws that can hit and you don't know which one hits or what, it would be a very bad spot to re-raise, simply because you don't know, especially against an aggressive player who will play both his made hands and his big draws aggressively, you don't know what is going to be the correct action if your raise is re-raised. So check raising on that flop is a mistake, simply because you don't know what you're going to do.
Now, did you say the board was King Jack 8? He flopped an offsuit 8, right? King Jack
King 9-8. King 9-8.
King 9-8. Oh, so he flopped bottom 2 pair. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the board is so draw heavy, the stacks are deep. This was a live game with deep stacks. That, there's just, if you check raise and your opponent calls, what card other than a 9 or an 8 is really going to make you comfortable on the turn to keep going? You know what I mean?
Right. And also, it's kind of funny too is that, sometimes people don't realize is that, if you think you're up against a stronger hand and your bottom 2 improves to a full house, a lot of times you're still not good, right? Exactly. The guy's got kings full or king 9, right? Yep.
And which is why this is an absolutely not a good spot to check raise. And so, I mean, the specifics of this of this hand are somewhat important, but the point I really want to emphasize is it comes back to the rule. Anytime you're going to make a bet or you're going to make a raise of a bet in No Limit Hold'em, you have to be able to answer the question, what are you going to do if you're re-raised? And you have to unequivocally know. Now, that doesn't mean you have to, that the answer could be that you're going to fold, but if you don't have a very clear-cut answer, if a raise is going to put you in a position where you don't know what the right play is, then you probably shouldn't be making that bet in the first place.
Now, what about betting? Now, this takes it kind of, because sometimes I do this, and, it might not be correct, Neiman, is I think I do fall into that trap sometimes where I might bet and make a raise or bet, or, I mean, usually if I'm making a raise, I'm going to, I'm not normally folding to a re-raise, it's kind of my style, but I'm betting and I get check raised. Is a proper answer, because sometimes, Neiman, I'll call to see what happens on a later street, especially if I'm in position. I raise with aces and the board comes out 9 deuce 3, draw heavy. A guy check raises me 300 big blinds deep. I'll call and see a safe card and get some sort of physical read from him on the turn.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying it's a mistake to call, to bet and call a check raise. I'm just saying, like when the board was 9. Okay, so you raise with aces. The opponent called, and the board comes down 9-8-3, maybe with 2 of a suit or something.
Right.
And he checks. Now, right now, when he checks, before you make that bet, you should know what you're going to do if he raises you.
Right.
Now,
I see what you're saying.
You do know what you're going to do. You bet, he raises, you've decided that you can call here.
Right, right.
And so, therefore, you can make the bet.
Right, I see what you're saying.
You understand what I'm saying?
I do, yeah.
Like, which is very different from a situation where you might not know. I mean, it's hard to think of an example. I gave that 9-8 of clubs example. I'm trying. If you want to deal with aces, how about an example like this? Let's say the board comes down Jack 10-9, and you raised with aces. And let's say you're playing against a very aggressive player,
right,
who will check raise you on this Jack 10-9 board with a flush draw, with a hand like Queen Jack, something like that. Let's say, or pocket queens or pocket eights, where he's got a pair and he's also open-ended that way. Let's say he will play those hands aggressively.
right.
Okay? But he's also going to check raise you with all the slew of hands that are ahead of you already or, can improve to be ahead of you. Jacks, 10s, 9s,
Right.
flop straight, so on. Now, in this case, maybe you'd want to consider not making that bet with aces. If he checks and you have the aces, you might want to return a check. Supposing you decide, no, you don't want to return the check, then you absolutely must have an answer to the question, what are you going to do if he raises you?
Right, I see what you're saying. And obviously the answer doesn't really specifically answer. It does not specifically matter. You just have to have an answer to the question.
That's right.
If you ask me,
a lot of times, no, you're absolutely right about that. That's the part that is easy to misinterpret in terms of what I'm saying. I'm not saying that whenever you make a bet for value, you should be able to call a raise or you should be able to shove a raise. Or if you're bluffing, I'm not saying I'm not saying anything like that. I'm just saying you have to know. I'm not telling you what that answer is. But what you don't want to do is be floundering when you face the raise. You know what I mean? Like, like for instance, I'll give you an example. Let's say that you have Queen Jack. Okay, you called a raise with Queen Jack suited against an aggressive player who draws pretty hard, but also plays made hands pretty hard. Okay, and let's say the flop comes down Jack 7-6, 2 suited, none of your suit. Okay, and now your opponent bets. This is probably not a good spot for a raise because if he re-raises you, you really don't know. You know what I mean? He could re-raise you there with a flush draw or with Jack 10, for instance. You know what I mean? Like, let's just say he overplays. Whatever. I mean, it's hard to come up with an example off the top of my head. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that you have to know what you're going to do. And if you put yourself in a situation where a raise would put you in a position where you don't know what the best play is or what the play that you would choose is, then you shouldn't make that raise or that bet in the first place.
Well, that's interesting though, because I've been watching a lot of more training videos lately, especially as I've had, more and more of these guys on, and I constantly hear them say, "Well, I'm going to bet here, but I have no real plan against a check raise, not yet." So it's kind of like totally the opposite of what you're saying. You know what I mean? Even with some of these instructors, I think that they seem to tending to be doing that, which obviously may be exploitable, or it's obviously not the correct thing to do.
I mean, yeah, I don't. It's I don't want to just go create some enemies.
Right.
But I just think that's horrible, and I think that's how I've made my living all these years, by playing against these players that don't have plans. You know what? Let me put it to you a different way. Sort of, poker at an advanced level is a lot about anticipating the play of a hand, anticipating the different branches that a hand might go. You know what I mean? And when you have, you don't want to make your decision in isolation. Like, you don't make a decision on a flop without consideration to what might happen on the turn or on the river or so on. Like, I have a very advanced student with whom I was discussing a hand, a scenario where we were talking about a good spot for a 3-barrel bluff, and we were talking about playing against a fairly tight standard player who opens, and you call from the big blind, and we said you call with Queen Jack. And we made up, we said we had a hypothetical flop of 9-8-6, okay? 9-8-6, 2 suited. And you have Queen Jack. Now, we decided that was a real good flop to attack and to just bet, to triple barrel bluff, into the raiser. And the reason is this: if he raises you at any time, you can fold because your hand, all you got is a gut shot. But if he calls you, there's going to be so many cards that come that continue to make the board look much more frightening in terms of from the vantage point of someone who had raised pre-flop and then called when led into on the flop.
Right, and especially if his calling range is almost 95% one pair overpair type hands, right?
Exactly, because sevens, fives, and tens. Well, 10 makes you the nuts.
Right.
Sevens and fives and put a 4 straight on the board.
A 9, the flush card, right?
Right. Any flush card completes a flush, and 9, pairs the top card, which is unlikely to be a card that's in his hand. But also, after he called you, it's unlikely that he has a hand like ace king or ace, assuming that he's not making like an ace high call. Let's say he probably's got some kind of a pair in his hand. So you can also win the pot when aces or kings or maybe queens come on the flop, because now if you continue betting into that, he probably no longer has an overpair to the board. You know what I mean? He can no longer beat the top card on the board. So there's very few cards, that can come out that are bad. Now, so the point of this construct of this hand is that, it's a good spot to bet setting up a multi-barrel bluff because of the anticipation of the range of cards that can come and how they will appear to your opponent. Now, I could talk in depth about this hand. It's a very advanced, complicated thing. We can talk at different levels about it. But the reason I introduced it was just to talk about the general principle that I had brought up, and that is that you have to have a plan that is not restricted to just the street and just the decision that you are currently on. In order to play poker well, you have to create a plan and anticipate the different branches that a hand may go based on the actions that you take in the current moment in the hand, and make the optimal decision for that. So,
go ahead.
Yeah. So getting back to like what you said, I've actually not spent any time on these training videos, so I haven't actually seen them. But it's really surprising, to me that even like the top, the instructors, who I assume are some of the top players, would make bets without a plan for a check raise. It's you set yourself up to make a mistake, make a big mistake.
Right. On that note, go ahead, Stephen. We're going to take a little commercial break here, and we will be back in a second here with Samoleus, and we'll continue on with this discussion.
Okay.
Cash plays. Previously on All Strategy with Negreanu, Bonomo, and Huff.
Now, when you're looking at online tournaments versus live, do you think that actually the most equatable tournament, and I just kind of came up with this as I was listening to you talk about it there, but if you're talking about you can play almost every hand when you're playing in the World Series of Poker main event because people are going to make big mistakes, is that somewhat equatable also to big field tournaments online, where it seems like even though I know the level of play has advanced in online poker, and there are a lot of great poker players playing online, but let's say an $11 buy-in, no rebuy tournament, in an event like that, is it also very similar where you think you can loosen up early and get people to make big mistakes because you are likely to be up? If there's 3,500 people, they're not all pros. They're not all great.
I know you've got something to say this, but literally the one problem with that is generally in these tournaments they're not deep stacked enough. The only way you can really get away with playing every hand is if the amount you're investing in to see each flop is a very small percentage of your overall stack size. And you don't see many tournaments, especially smaller buy-ins, that play deep stack like that.
Yeah, the big thing with the number of players is if you have an event like the World Series main event with, 8,000 players, there's just not that many good players in the world. So you're going to have many weaker players. And Daniel's definitely correct. Stack size is basic. There's two basic things that determine how you should play at the start of a tournament: the stack size and how strong the competition is. So, when we're talking about these $11 tournaments online, you just can't, call these raises with weak hands hoping to hit. Your implied odds just aren't there.
All Strategy. Listen and learn. Cash Plays.
And we are back on Cash Plays. Neiman, before the break, we were talking about having a plan when you bet or raise, and then we were just touching on the fact that it was surprising that some instructors in videos might not have a plan, or even saying on their videos that I'm going to bet here, and I don't really know what I'm going to do if I face resistance.
Yeah, and again, and that's it's just an out and out mistake. I mean, if you can't put yourself in positions to make mistakes. And notice that when I say mistakes, I don't mean necessarily blowing off money with a second best hand. I also mean, folding the best hand too. You know what I mean? Like, you don't want to. There was a long time ago. I read an article. It was an excellent article by Brandon Adams, and I think it was in Bluff magazine, though I wouldn't swear by that. In which he talked about this very concept, and he talked about check raising on a queen high board after you had called a pre-flop raise from the blinds with ace queen being a horrible play if you're playing deep stack, and he explained it in a lot of detail, and it's basically the same concept here. You put yourself in a situation where you're leaving yourself the possibility of making a big mistake if you're re-raised. You know what I mean? You don't know if you're going to fold the best hand or whether you're going to call with the worst hand, and you don't want to put yourself in those kind of situations. And so therefore, how do you protect against that? Well, you protect against that by anticipating that possibility before you make a bet and know what you're going to do. And if you don't know what you're going to do, don't make the bet.
That seems kind of like a way ahead, way behind type situation, because what if I were to say, and it might not be fundamentally correct, but what if I were to say, all right, I'm going to check raise this board with ace queen on a queen high board deep, and if the guy re-raises me, Neiman, I'm going to fold, and if the guy calls, I'm going to check. That's my plan. Now, it might be a bad plan, but at least it's a plan, right?
Well, yes, and if you're playing it, remember, it's all of your play has to be optimized for your opponents and their tendencies, right? Let's just say that, okay, there's a queen high board, and you're playing against, I want to make up a hypothetical opponent. Let's just say that you're going to play against a guy who will continuation bet with any pair, any piece, and will call the check raise with any pair or any piece, any queen. But he would always re-raise you with a better hand and never re-raise you with a worse hand. And then if he calls you and you check, he won't try to take it away from you. He'll just try to check and get a free showdown. Well, obviously, against a player like this, the correct play is, in fact, to check raise.
Right, that's against the absolute optimal opponent in this situation, right?
But, unfortunately, most of our opponents aren't as accommodating, And if you check raise there against a normal good player, and first of all, if he re-raises you, maybe you can fold, but maybe maybe he's one of these real aggressive players that's playing king queen that way, and if that's in his arsenal, then you can't. But let's say he just calls. Even then, you've put yourself in an awkward position, because now, if the turn is some random card, are you going to keep betting? Maybe he's got kings here. You know what I mean? Or, maybe he's slow playing a monster. He's got you trapped up. But at the same time, now after check raising, if you check, how are you going to handle him betting into you? Because if you check raise and then check, you're certainly telegraphing weakness. You know what I mean? And by the way, this actually gives me a real good segue to talk about another important principle in poker. This is actually really another really important thing that people don't quite qualify, and they don't. Some players do it without understanding they do it, and a lot of players just simply don't do it, and it's very important. Here's the principle. If you are trying to win a hand without getting to showdown, then obviously you want to over-represent your hand. That part's obvious, right?
Right.
But if you want to win a hand at showdown, you want this hand to show down, you're trying to win the hand for value, then you want to under-represent your hand. You know what I mean? So
right.
When you have and that's something, I mean, it seems obvious when I say it, I would presume, but it's not. In practice, people don't play that way. You know what I mean? They take like a top pair, top kicker hand, and they raise it, and it's just, like, okay, I'll give you another example of something I see online a lot, and it's really you put yourself in a position to make a big mistake. Let's say you're playing against an opponent who plays a lot of speculative hands and plays his draws hard, okay? And let's say you call a raise with 10-9 suited, and let's say the flop comes down 10-5-4 with a draw, okay? And he bets into you. So many times I see players raise this with the 10-9 suited, and it's such a bad play because, again, assuming your opponent's frequencies are well balanced. Because now if he re-raises you, you may be folding the best hand against him being aggressive or pushing a draw or pushing just ace-king, trying to sniff out weakness. But at the same time, if you decide to continue with the hand, you may be continuing drawing dead or extremely thin. You know what I mean? Clearly, this is a hand where you should not be raising, because when you ask yourself the question, if I raise this, what am I going to do if I'm re-raised? You don't have a good answer. You don't have a plan, and therefore you shouldn't make the raise.
Right. And the funny thing too is that a lot of people don't understand this, and this is what I talk about at the lower limits, and I'm talking about even at as high as 10-20 live and lower. You're talking about underrepresenting your hand, to get the most value. But a lot of times, the best way to seem to be underrepresenting your hand to a weak opponent, and what I mean by weak opponent is a fairly bad opponent, is to actually fast play your hand in the sense where this guy raises with, let's say he raises Neiman and I call with pocket sevens, okay? And the board comes out 7-3. And he throws out a pot and a half. I mean, you see these live donks do it all the time. He throws out a pot and a half size bet on a 2-flush board, okay? I 100% know that he has an overpair. Now, a way for me to overrepresent my hand against a weak opponent there is to actually raise now, because they would never think that you would raise with a set. Now, when you start moving up, when people start understanding value of hands,
you mean underrepresent your hand?
The best way for me to underrepresent my hand is actually to fast play my monster, right? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. I absolutely agree with that. I absolutely agree. Yeah, I'm not. I definitely am not an advocate of slow play. Again, that's this whole principle is also amplified in today's game. I know on last week's show we were talking about the state of online poker today, and one of the things that we had discussed is how much more aggressively it's being played, such that people, it's people don't find folds very often. They can't make a big fold, so it's really not, and especially with everyone pushing draws so hard and everything, it's really not a good idea to slow play, a monster, except in the very rare cases, So. Yeah, I totally agree with you 110%. Absolutely, you should be raising that. And in doing so, you are, in fact, in a way, in a manner of speaking, you are underrepresenting your hand.
Right. I want to move on to a question that a guy in the forum asked. This comes from Duckslayer. And this actually is something that I've been struggling with a little bit too, Neiman. And he basically wants to ask kind of a general question about, he says he's been struggling with hands like ace-king, ace-queen, and ace-jack. He says, out of position, I've been doing a lot of open limping. Now, let's specifically take, say, like an ace-queen, an ace-jack, and a king-queen offsuit type of hand. And I know that we've said that we want to talk about this online, but we can take all variables of these hands. Because I had to tell you, Neiman, before I almost told myself as a general rule that I would never really flat call a raise preflop with king-queen off or ace-jack off. And so what I do is, when I'm in late position against like a late position opener, I find myself 3-betting or folding, when now I realize that sometimes the right play might be just a call because he's going to fold out ranges of hands that I dominate to a 3-bet.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, and I think that this situation is a very, very good example of one of the ways that we have to, we being winning poker players, have to adjust to the changing landscape of internet poker. There was a time when I would completely agree with you with what you used to do, which is never ever call a raise with king queen offsuit or ace jack offsuit. Why is that? Even ace queen I never used to call with, and the reason is because those hands are reverse implied odds hands, right? Like if you hit your hand and your opponent's putting in a lot of money, then you're likely to be dominated. However, you're not going to win a lot of money from your opponent after the flop if you hit your hand, if he's got a hand like jacks or something like that. So
right.
your hand is, if you hit your hand and your opponent's willing to put in a lot of money, it means that, you have, you're likely to be dominated, and therefore it's not a good hand to take to the flop, because if you hit a hand, you're not going to get paid off if he has a worse hand. That used to be the way things were. But with the ramped up aggression of today's game, you have to make the evaluation, what is your opponent's raising range? And against your opponent's raising range, what is he, how much is he going to call? Because nowadays, you could call a raise with king, queen, and if a king hits, for instance, you may get 3 bets post-flop. I'm talking more in the online game than the live game. You may get 3 bets post-flop with somebody that has king-jack easily. You may even get 2 bets from someone who flopped middle pair, who then checks on the river and calls a value bet from you or something. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's the game is played with a lot more aggression and a lot more. People are folding less. They're less willing to fold. So now you can take those same hands that used to be dominated are now dominating, a good percentage of the time as well. Now, having said that, I would say proceed with caution with those hands, because you still do run the risk of being dominated yourself. You know what I mean? So, I still don't think as a default against, average players, I don't think it's a good idea to flat call pre-flop with those hands. I actually do think, way more than before, that it is a good idea to flat call with hands like ace-king. Simply because, that hand can't really be dominated except if you're against aces or kings. If you hit your hand, you by definition have top pair, top kicker. And, you're likely to have your opponent pay you off a lot. Because, and again, that's very different from the way poker used to be, because people just don't believe you anymore when you're betting. You know what I mean? So they tend to pay off more.
Now, the interesting thing about flat calling with ace king, and I actually have been doing this a little more in my game as well, is I sometimes get lost Neiman when a dry board comes. And let's say like I'm heads up and I have position on the guy, and the board comes out 10-7-3 and he makes a standard continuation bet. I would think that I'm losing too much value by at least not calling once or even twice, because I have to have the best hand there a lot of the time, right? Even with no pair.
Yeah, you have to. A lot of that has to do with you got to evaluate your opponent's frequencies of action, which you always have to do in poker. That's the essence really of playing poker at an advanced level. You have to take the frequency with which your opponent handles situations and optimize your play against that. So, for instance, a lot of what we see today is that people continuation bet on the flop all the time, right? But then they don't fire second barrels enough. Really, if they're not going to fire as much on the turn, then they shouldn't be firing as much on the flop. So one common weakness we see in the online game today with most players is that their flop, if they're the pre-flop raiser, their flop betting frequency is too high relative to their turn betting frequency. So that makes those type of hands, like the ace-king kind of hands, it makes them profitable to call a flop bet with a lot of the time. You know what I mean? Because you're getting that auto continuation bet almost every time, and then you can call, and at the same time, if they bet again on the turn, you can pretty comfortably fold. Not to mention, it's going to be a little bit hard to put you on that hand if you do hit it, after the flop on the turn or the river. And then depending on your opponent and his tendencies and what you think his range is, you can choose to turn your hand into a bluff later if he checks after the flop, or you can choose to show down with it. So yeah, it really comes down to evaluating your opponent's frequencies. Now, on the other hand, if your opponent does have good frequencies, meaning he bets the flop commensurate with betting the turn frequently enough, so that he's going to put you in tough spots. You don't want to just sit down and say, okay, I have ace king, I'm going to kind of buckle down and just call him down and close my eyes and hope I'm good. You know what I mean? That against players that do balance their frequencies well, you have to balance yourself well. Against those opponents, you may want to, 3-bet with that hand a little more often pre-flop, or you might want to just fold to the flop bet sometimes, even though you have, the best hand a fair percentage of the time. You may want to try to raise the flop bet, and now and again, just turn your hand into a straight bluff. The play becomes trickier as the opponents become better. But the more formulaically your opponent plays, the more you can actually do that. I don't think it's against a typical not so great opponent. I think a reasonable way to play ace king would be to flat call pre-flop and then call a flop bet on a miss, and then on the turn either check back and try to get to a showdown if he checks, or just bet if he checks. I think that's
that's actually an interesting spot too in the turn. It kind of led me to the next logical question, and obviously kind of player dependent, but a couple things for the listeners to think about too is that you call off the flop, and now the turn the guy checks to you, and you're fairly certain that a good portion of the time you have the best hand. In other cases, he might have a small pocket pair that he would just fold to your bet. However, if you do bet the turn, do you sometimes worry that you are getting hands that you dominate to fold on the turn that you might be able to extract value from on the river, like ace, jack, king, queen, ace, queen, stuff like that?
Well, not if an ace hasn't flopped. Right? It's not like you're going to... I think I was following you until the very last thing you said, Bart, because it's not like you're... let's say you have ace king, and the flop comes down all low, and you call a flop bet. You've already called a flop bet.
Right.
It's not like you want to necessarily keep ace queen in, because you're not going to get paid off anyway. If they would fold to a turn bet, they're going to fold to a river bet unless they hit anyway.
No, what I'm saying is that would you not want to check back? First of all, you've got showdown value with ace king, right?
Right.
And then you're going to get value if an ace hits. And otherwise, if a queen doesn't hit, you're good anyways. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying, but I think the consideration of keeping ace queen, ace jack around just in the off chance that an ace hits and you can extract value, I don't think that's really... Yeah,
I guess it's only really two outs, right? With
exactly.
One card to come.
The parlay of your two outer hitting and that being the type of hand your opponent has is way too great for that to be much of a consideration.
Right. Just one other quick thing with his question that I want to get to. It's pretty much a consensus now that no one really ever open limps in six max. You know what I mean? So when he's talking about open limping, what do you think about open limping with ace king, ace queen, ace jack in full ring games? Would you ever open? And again, player dependent. When you're playing at Foxwoods, you ever been known to open limp with ace queen stuff like that, like ace jack? I don't usually limp with ace jack. I know that from up front.
I pretty much never open limp.
Even in full ring.
Yeah, okay. I might limp along, in a full ring game. Again, I play mostly as you correctly said, I only play live a couple times a year, which is, I go to Foxwoods when the WPT comes there. I'll be going there, in a week now. This will be, my second trip out there this year. But most of my play is online, which, I certainly never limp online in a six max game. I think the answer to whether you should in a full ring game and stuff, it really comes down to, how the game is playing. I think if you're in a situation where open raising, you're usually going to get a whole slew of callers, which, certain tables play that way, then you probably don't necessarily want to open raise with hands that don't play really well in a multi-way pot, like ace jack offsuit or something like that. But it's really, so much of it is a function of how the table's going to play. You know what I mean? If you open raise, what is your expectation? How many people are going to see the flop? And how well do they play? How are you going to handle situations if you flop a top pair and there's three others to the flop? You sort of have to have your pulse on the players and on the flow of the game to really answer that effectively. As a general rule, I don't think limping is a great idea, and the reason is that in poker and no limit hold'em, people don't actually have hands very often, have great hands. So the person who exercises initiative is usually rewarded with the pot in all those hands in which people don't have much. The person with the initiative has the first right to the pot, if you will. And so it's nice, as long as people are conceding to that initiative, it's nice to try to seize that whenever you can. So so that's why I like to if I choose to enter a pot that hasn't been raised already, I like to come in with a raise, and I think that that's generally a good idea. The times when you should be doing more limping is when stacks are deep and people are seeing the flop no matter what. You don't want to necessarily be in a situation where you're blowing off a lot of money by you raise with ace queen and you get 6 callers, and now the flop comes down with whatever and you bet, and now you get 3 callers, and now you know what I mean, and now you check, and you can blow through a lot of money like that.
Sorry, we had a little bit of a technical difficulty there, Neiman, but you were talking about how just kind of open limping isn't necessarily the greatest strategy.
Yeah, with the sort of the caveat that there are situations, especially in live games and especially in full ring games, where it may in fact be better to open limp, but in general, I think it's not. Being able to take the initiative is usually a good thing.
All right, I have just about 2 more questions for you before I let you go. This question comes from Garlic over on the Poker Road forums, and I'm not sure if you can answer this question, Neiman, so if you can't, you can't. But he says, do you think that there are any fundamental aspects of the nosebleed regulars game, and he says he's talking about, say, 200, 400 no limit and up, to be incorrect? He says, I've noticed that as the limits go higher, the aggression gets higher and higher. Is this just the natural progression of hold'em as the skill increases? Now, Neiman, we talked about how your view last week was that it just becomes more of a gambling game. So I'm not sure if you kind of have the same answer to that question. Have you had a chance to see any of those? Do you ever rail any of those, like super nosebleed stakes games?
I don't actually rail them, but I've got plenty of friends that play in them, and I discuss with them. And it's. Are
there any fundamental flaws that you think are going on?
I don't. Generally, I wouldn't say that there are fundamental flaws, but I would very strongly caution players that aren't playing that high from, you got to be very careful if you try to glean from that play, because basically what happens in those nosebleed games is that people are taking, taking the principle that I had just talked about, that being that usually in a poker hand, people don't have anything. You're not going to be able to beat top pair most of the time. So let's say there's 2 to the flop, a pre-flop raise and a call. Usually, the best hand is not going to be as good as top pair. So the way that the game is played all the way up to the nosebleed games is that the person that exercises the initiative and incorporates fold equity best, maybe coupled with hand-making equity, like when they're on a draw or something, is going to win those pots. But I think what happens in the nosebleed games is that they take that to the very, very extreme and try to, evaluate literally mathematically for almost how often, their third pair is going to be good and so on. And if it is, if they think it is, they'll actually hammer away at it and, play it for a full buy-in and stuff. So that, I think that's wherein the difference lies. And it's because that's how so many players are playing at the nosebleed games. They've all gotten, all being the good players at those limits, they've all gotten pretty good at evaluating how good their hands are, what their hand strength is against their opponent's range, given the sequence of action. However, you can't take that and apply that to the lower games, because the principles that apply in those nosebleed games, they apply because the opponents are playing a certain way. But if if you have a situation where, you've got second pair and your opponent, bets the flop and check raises the turn and bets all in on the river, and you're pretty sure he's doing it for value, well, obviously your hand's no good if you're playing, 10-20 or lower, but in those nosebleed games, players just might be doing that for value with second pair good kicker, which makes your second pair weak kicker no good, and it becomes like a thinner. They may be doing that with for value with second pair weak kicker, which makes your second pair good kicker actually good. And you know what I mean? There's more. I know a good way to explain it. When you play poker at limits of, let me say, 25-50 on down, you usually, when you're facing heat, your hand is almost always, if you're facing like big bets from your opponent, your hand, in almost all cases, you are losing to value bets and beating bluffs. And it's pretty polarized that way, because when people are making big bets at you, they're either bluffing or they've got an extremely strong hand.
Or which a hand could have a lot of equity too if it's semi-bluff, right?
Right. That too. Yeah. When I say a strong hand, I'm including, strong drawing hands and so on. But now, when you get to the nosebleed games, it's not polarized like that. You could be facing massive heat and massive strength from a hand that your opponent is betting for value, but still your hand may be better than that, even though you have sort of a marginally good hand. There's a whole nother layer there, which simply doesn't apply at the lower stakes, just because it doesn't. It's when people are blasting away at pots, they've either got a big draw, a big hand, or a big bluff. They're not doing that with marginal hands. And therefore, if you have a marginal hand and you're facing that kind of action, all you have to decide is he bluffing or is he not bluffing? Whereas in the nosebleed games, and if you've got a marginal hand, you're facing that kind of action, you may be losing to a monster, you may be beating a stone bluff, but there's also a range of value betting hands where your hand may fall in the middle of that range somewhere.
Right. And actually, I think you see that a lot, too, when you start to get to heads up. I had a couple of guys over, the World Series, guys like Krantz and stuff like that, and Raptor over the summer, talking about merging their ranges, and you see these incredibly huge pots heads up, where like Antonius will play for a huge stack when the board comes out King 5-7 and he has King 3 suited. I'm assuming that, and again, that's different heads up, but when you're playing down at the lower levels, like you said, the polarization between bluff and value bet is just, there isn't so much of that range that's in the middle, right?
Yeah, exactly, and this is also magnified a lot in heads up too, because at heads up, even at lower limits, you could be playing 2-4, 1-2 heads up, whatever. I've seen that with some of my students. You're in situations where you are in fact betting for value with marginal hands, and your opponents are calling for value with marginal hand. You know what I mean? And it becomes more of an evaluation and interpretation of the whole range kind of thing. It's because in heads up there's a lot more. You got, there's obviously the weaker hand is the best hand. Weaker hands are the best hand more often. So you have to, if you keep conceding, if you've got anything less than top pair, then you're playing weak tight. And so when people compensate for that, you run into this decision-making process. And that whole decision-making process that I'm referring to applies to the full 6 max games in the nosebleed games.
Right. One last question, and it's kind of an interesting question, not specifically, a strategy question, but I thought it was interesting. This comes from Bazman76. And he says, Neiman, if you could send yourself a brief message back in time to when you started playing poker, what would you say? What would you tell yourself that you know now that would help yourself out when you were just starting out?
Oh, I like that question. That's a cool question.
Yeah.
Well, I can definitely tell you one thing that I would have told myself is that when I first started playing poker, I mean, I don't know if he's asking more in terms of strategy or more in terms of just general, but I can answer it both ways. But in terms of just general, I could definitely say, don't expect the poker landscape to be the way it is forever.
Right, of course. It was much different when you started, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm still doing very well. I'm still, making a lot more money than I would if I was in a normal job, but it's considerably less than it has been, in years past. And I expect that whole window is, I wouldn't say closing, but it's a lot harder to stay way ahead of the curve. You know what I mean? And it's something that I didn't really put much thought into. I just started playing poker and I was like, wow, this is so easy. Not so easy, but it's, this is so, wow, I can, make $20,000 a day for the rest of my life is what I was thinking. You know what I mean?
Right.
And now I'm like, okay, now I realize, that was an example of not being ready to make concessions to the dynamism of the whole poker landscape. So that's sort of my answer in terms of general. I don't know if this question was intended more from a strategy standpoint. If it was,
what would you have to say about strategy too?
Yeah, let me think. That's a good. That's a good. I guess I would say. This actually kind of goes hand in hand with my general answer too. I would say, always be flexible and be malleable. Find the best strategies that are working for you now, but don't etch them into stone, and be willing to be fluid and dynamic, such that you can optimize to the changing of the game. And so, a good example of that is, something that you had talked about a little bit earlier. You'd said that how you used to not call with king, queen off and ace, jack off. You used to never flat call raises just because of the risk of being dominated. And now you actually do flat call with those just for the very opposite reason, because now you let people be in with hands that you dominate. And that's a good example of a great adjustment that you've made to the change in the spectrum of the way poker's played today. And that's the kind of thing that, maybe at times I've been slow to adjust, because, I was such a successful player. I mean, I still am, but I mean, the amount of the speed and success with which I was plowing through the poker world a few years ago, it made me feel very set in stone about the strategies that I created for myself. And one of my weaknesses, perhaps, especially recently, has been not being able to let go of those when those are no longer the optimal plays as quickly. Like, it took me a while to realize, with all the three betting and all the re-raising going on right now, that I can't, just keep raising and keep calling re-raises with my speculative hands as often. You know what I mean? Like, I have to be selective with those and so on. Things like that. It was definitely the right strategy, a year ago, and it's definitely, while not quite the wrong strategy, it's definitely something that that needs to be adjusted for, and that's what I would have told myself when I started. Create your strategies, but don't be married to them.
Well, that's a very, very good answer. Neiman, why don't you give out your email address? We touched on it briefly last week about if people are interested in private coaching. You said actually that private coaching are filled, but you might consider doing, kind of group coaching or forum coaching. So go ahead and shoot your email out again.
Yeah, sure will. It's my first and last name, Neiman Kenkre, NIMANKENKRE @yahoo.com. And yeah, I do both private and group coaching. My private lessons are full right now, but I'd be happy to add anybody who's interested to my wait list. And I recently finished a group, and so I if there's enough interest, I would be happy to reopen a group coaching lesson, which as I said last week, it would be more economical than my regular private lesson rate. It would be somewhere between 4 to 6 or 7 students, and we'd have group discussions and group video analysis and stuff like that. And when I started doing that earlier this year, and it's worked out really well to date. So if any of your listeners would like to contact me and express some interest in both private and or group lessons, I'd be happy to add them to the list and hopefully start up a new group in the near future.
Would you ever consider doing like training videos like that's kind of, or have you ever considered doing kind of what the standard training videos
Yeah,
are?
actually I have. I was debating whether or not I'm actually able to say this, and since I'm not sure, I won't give any details about this, but I've actually been working on a soon-to-be-launched website that will be doing training videos that in a little bit different vein, bringing something new to the table than some of the other sites that we've seen.
Can I at least ask you if is it totally unaffiliated with any site that exists right now?
Yes, it's completely unaffiliated.
So it's a totally new site.
New site. It will be a competitor. Okay. It's headed by the big name that's going to be the most active pro on the site is Phil Galfond.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, if stay tuned. This site will be launching very soon, and I'm going to be affiliated with that site. I don't, due to a few personal commitments and a few work things that had to do with some stuff outside of poker. I'm not sure that I'll be able to spend the same amount of time as I had originally intended on that site, but I can certainly vouch for the pros on the site, and I expect it to be a great website, a great source of training. And I do also intend to be a participant and have some videos, just perhaps not quite as much as I had initially thought. But again, it's still my level of participation is still a little bit undecided yet. I'm trying to figure out how much time I can spend, and we're trying to work out a system. But it's certainly going to be an exciting site, in my opinion.
Well, Neiman, Samoleus, Punkity, thank you very, very much again for coming on the show. First repeat interviewee, first person that's done 2 parts as well, and you got another 2 hours of great content over the last couple weeks. So again, I really appreciate you taking the time, Neiman.
Thank you so much, Bart. I enjoyed it very much. I really appreciate you having me on there. And
great.
We'll look forward to doing it again, perhaps sometime in the future.
And we will all see you next week.